Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of 247 DIY. I've got the 2012 Forester back up here on the lift, and as you saw from the intro, I've got quite a bit of a power steering leak here from one of the hard lines underneath the power steering rack. I bought the new replacement here from Subaru. It's a pretty cheap part, it's only 22 bucks, and fingers crossed we won't have to drop the power steering rack out of the subframe in order to replace this. But we won't know any of that until we go ahead and get some things disassembled and get a better look at it, so let's take care of that. All right, so the first thing I want to do is take down this bracket here. It's the factory jacking point for the front end of the vehicle. And even though this is not a turbo Forester, I did add this turbo splash shield up here on the front end just to try to keep some of the salty wintertime splash out from underneath there after we replaced the catalytic converter manifold. That was in a previous episode. I'll link that below if you're curious on how to change that manifold out on one of these FB25 Foresters. But we have to go ahead and get this plate down, so I will undo the skid plate right here. I don't think I'll take the whole plastic skid plate down, and then we'll get this bracket out of here. All right, and so I did end up taking that splash shield down only because the one fitting here, if I can get the camera to cooperate, that's one end of the hard line, and when that fitting comes undone, the fluid that's gonna drip out of there would have dripped right onto the edge of the splash shield. So just to keep things clean, I took that splash shield down. And then the actual line in question is this one here. That's all the way on the top. You can see there's this bottom line here. In the intro, you'll have saw that I got both of these lines just on the off chance that this longer line needed to come out to get enough room to get this one out. I knew I was probably going to screw up the fittings on this, so I just wanted to have that on hand. It also was not expensive. It was they were both the same price. They were both $22 for both lines. And so this little guy here is this fitting right here on your power steering rack. I think I can get to that fitting. I think I have enough angle there to get to that. But then that comes all the way down, wraps over, and comes up under there that I already showed you right there on the power steering rack. So we're gonna have to go ahead and at least start getting those fittings undone and go from there. All right, so it's a bit of a tough angle here to get the camera in, but this is the first fitting that we need to try to get undone, and it's probably arguably gonna be the hardest one to get to, so that's why I'm gonna start with this one. It's always better to try to start with what's gonna be the more difficult stuff and then work to the easier stuff when it comes to working on cars. So we're gonna go ahead and try to get this one undone first. And these are 12 millimeter fittings. So I'm gonna use a 12 millimeter line wrench to start. Arguably that's the right tool to use here. But in my experience with all this rust, a lot of times they just wanna round out. So we may end up having to try to see if we can squeeze a pair of vice grips under there, which I'm not too confident about because there's not a lot of room here, but let's try this line wrench first to see if that works. All right, so the other one really doesn't want to budge. I've transitioned to come over here. I think I have an idea for that side. And again, the reason why this is just being really not straightforward is I'm trying to do as little disassembly as possible. If you tried to bring this to like a dealer or a shop, they probably want to drop your rack right out of the subframe, which is a whole bunch of disassembly that I think I can get away without having to do. So I want to see if I can get this fitting here. And then, like I said, I think I have an idea for the other side. All right, so we got that fitting successfully undone. I'm gonna go ahead and off camera just keep playing with this, see if I can't get it with the wrench at first, and then if that doesn't work, we'll move on to another method. All right, so yeah, all I ended up doing was just rounding this off with the line wrench. But I think if I can cut this line off, it's not like we're trying to reuse it or anything like that. If I can cut this line off, I think, even though it is at a bit of an angle towards the subframe here, I think I'll have enough room to get a thin-walled socket on there. I hope I don't need an easy out because my easy outs are not thin-walled. But either way, it's not like it's gonna negatively affect having this cut off, and it's at least one thing to try before we have to start resorting to some disassembly here. All right, so there we go. That worked. We got the fitting out of there. I got kind of nervous at first when it started screwing out of there. It didn't look like it was screwing, like actually coming out, and I thought it had tore the threads out of the rack, and that was going to be a really bad day, namely just in terms of more time not being able to drive the Forester because it would have took me a while to get a new rack in, but that came out perfectly fine. So now I have to see if we can go ahead and snake that new line in without disconnecting anything, because that would be the easiest. I have a feeling that easy is not going to be an option with that, but we won't know until we try. So let's go ahead and see if we can get that new line in there. All right, and this is one of those times where I don't mind being wrong. I was able to get that up in there. It was a little bit tight. I was absolutely trying my best not to ding up this new line, because living here in New York, when it comes to rust, things like this rusting out, a lot of times that's what it is you get a rock chip or something in the factory coatings or the factory paint, and then it starts to really, really rust from there. So I was just trying my best not to get any scratches or gouges in that brand new line. Hopefully keep that in there for a good long time without rusting out again. So now all we got to do is go ahead and tighten those fittings back down, which should be a lot easier now that we've got fresh fittings going into clean threads. I should be able to use my wrenches no problem. And once that is secure and tight, we can go ahead, lower the vehicle down, and fill it back up with power steering fluid. All right, there we go. That's both fittings tightened down. If you saw there when I sped it up, when this fitting, this one over here, is threaded all the way out, because it is on that angle towards the subframe, you don't have room to get a line wrench in there, so I had to use a set of long reach needle nose pliers and just thread that in until it bottomed out, and then you have enough room between the subframe and the fitting to get your line wrench and actually tighten that down. Cleaned up all the power steering fluid, and so now we can set this down and refill the system. And so we're going to be going ahead and filling up with some automatic transmission fluid. Pretty much every Subaru, or at least every Subaru that I'm familiar with, uses ATF for their power steering fluid. We're going to go ahead and at least top the reservoir up first, and then we're going to go ahead and get to bleeding the system. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to turn the wheels lock to lock. Obviously you're going to have to put your keys in the ignition to undo the security steering column interlock. That way you can get it fully to lock and unlock. We're not going to start the car yet. If you start the car now with all that air in there, it's going to go through the pump, and once it goes through that pump, it gets all churned up, and what's going to happen is you're going to aerate the fluid, and you're going to have all these teeny tiny little bubbles through your fluid. You can't bleed it when your fluid's aerated like that. You'll have to let it sit, preferably overnight, for all those little tiny bubbles to work their way out into big bubbles, and then you can start over again. So you want to avoid getting that fluid aerated. I'm also just going to go in one direction first, probably have to top it off, go back the other direction. We want to avoid, like I said, churning this fluid a lot and aerating it. That's just going to give you troubles in trying to bleed all of the air out, because in my experience, at least with Subarus, they can be kind of a pain to get fully bled, and so you don't have that whining, that little bit of whine from the systems. But it is possible. You just have to be very cautious not to aerate the fluid. So we're going to go ahead and get all the air out of there, and hopefully we'll be done with this project. So now that I've worked the wheel back and forth, lock to lock, you kind of just keep going till you really don't hear any sounds of like air sloshing or gurgling around. I've found that you're never going to get to the point where you don't hear any more air at all, but I'm at the point now where I feel good enough. We're going to go ahead and start the car. That'll cycle the pump, and that should be able to draw any remaining air out of there without causing any issues with aeration like I had mentioned, because now we have the biggest air pockets already worked out of the rack. All we got to do now is just cycle this and get the last little bit of air out of there. All right, so that actually drew down a bit more fluid than I thought, and you could hear it. It was really kind of wanting to aerate and whine a lot. So we're going to top it back off. Try it again. All right, and so now our system's all bled. I went back lock to lock a couple of times. Remember, if you're doing that and you have the cap off, you probably saw the fluid jump a little bit. That was when you get all the way and you hit that steering lock, the fluid will jump a little bit. So don't slam it all the way to the lock, because then it'll really jump out of there. But I went lock to lock back and forth. I'm happy with that. And so then on the side of this particular reservoir on my Forester here, it's got 4 hash marks. It has hot max, cold max, hot minimum, and cold minimum marks. I'm going to go off the cold minimum, maybe just a little bit higher. We ran it for a little bit, but I doubt the fluid's actually hot right now, hot enough to have brought the level up. So I'm just going to bring it probably to that cold max line. We are quite a bit. We're actually a decent way over the hot max line. So off camera, I'm just going to draw that off, that fluid out of there. So we're down to the cold max line. And then the next couple of days when I drive this, when I get to where I'm going or when I get back from wherever I'm going, I'll just monitor this. There could be a little bit of air left in the system, and then sometimes those little bubbles will come out and your fluid might drop a little bit. So we'll just keep an eye on it and top off as needed. Didn't sound like there was air in there, but sometimes that can happen. And really, that's the end of the video. All I got to do now is, I didn't see anything actively dripping under the car when we started it. I'm going to lift it back up here and just look at those fittings and see if we have any drips. And I got to throw that splash shield back underneath, and this job is done. So that's going to go ahead and wrap this repair up. As always, guys, if you like the video, be sure to hit that like button. Feel free to leave a comment below, and if you're not subscribed already, please consider subscribing. Thanks.